In a quiet suburban kitchen in Ohio, a 72-year-old widow faced the ultimate betrayal. What started as an ordinary Tuesday morning took a devastating turn when legal documents stripped away everything she'd built. Soliva Turner wasn't your typical retiree. For 50 years, she had sacrificed her dreams for her ungrateful son, known for unwavering dedication to family above all else. When Marcus's cold ultimatum demanded she leave his house, she discovered unexpected strength. Soliva's audacious decision would lead to self-discovery across an ocean. The Swiss Alpine village of Grindelwald would never be the same. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus's key turned in the lock with the same metallic authority he'd wielded in boardrooms for 25 years. Soliva Turner looked up from her morning tea, the china cup trembling slightly in her 72-year-old hands. She'd heard that particular sound 10,000 times. But today it carried something different. Something final. "We need to talk." His voice cut through the comfortable silence of the kitchen she'd maintained for half a century. No greeting. No acknowledgement of the fresh flowers she'd arranged on the table, or the way the morning light caught the prisms she'd hung in the window. Small touches that had once made him smile as a boy. Marcus dropped a manila folder onto the polished oak surface, the papers inside rustling with the weight of official documents. His suit was impeccable, charcoal gray with a subtle pinstripe that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Everything about him screamed success, from his Italian leather shoes to the Rolex that caught the light as he pulled out a chair. Yet his eyes held the same wounded anger she'd been trying to heal for 37 years, ever since his father's funeral. "I've had the deed transferred." The words hit her like a physical blow. "This house is mine now. Has been for 6 months, actually. I just hadn't found the right time to discuss the transition." Soliva set down her cup with practiced care, the way she'd taught herself to do everything since David died. Carefully, deliberately, without making waves. "I don't understand. The mortgage was in Dad's name. When he died, you never properly transferred ownership. Legally, it should have gone to his heir." Marcus opened the folder, revealing documents thick with legal terminology and official seals. "I've rectified that oversight." The kitchen seemed to shrink around her. This room, where she'd packed his lunches for 12 years of school, where she'd helped him with homework at this very table, where she'd celebrated his graduation, his first job, his engagement, where she'd cried alone after his wedding when he'd made it clear that his new wife's family would be handling the major holidays from now on. "Marcus, this is my home. I've lived here for 43 years. I've maintained it, paid the property taxes, the insurance, with money I've been sending you." His interruption was surgical in its precision. "The monthly checks that have kept this place running while you've been playing house. The monthly checks. $500 that arrived like clockwork, always with a pre-printed note. For household expenses. M. Never, 'Love, Marcus,' or 'Hope you're well, Mom.' Just that single initial, as if affection was too costly to spell out in full. "I never asked for those checks," she said quietly. "No, but you cashed them." He leaned back in his chair, the gesture somehow managing to be both casual and threatening. "For 15 years you've been living off my income. Consider this, a change in management." Soliva's mind raced back to the insurance money. The life insurance policy David had taken out when Marcus was born, the one he'd insisted on even when money was tight. She'd never touched it, had kept it in a separate account like a sacred trust. Marcus didn't know about it. She'd planned to surprise him with it someday, maybe for a down payment on a house when he'd married, or for his children's education. But his wife had made it clear that Soliva's financial contributions weren't welcome, and somehow the years had passed without the right moment presenting itself. "The senior living facility in Meadowbrook has an opening," Marcus continued, his tone taking on the rehearsed quality of a presentation he'd practiced. "It's a nice place, clean, organized activities, people your own age." He slid a brochure across the table, its glossy surface showing smiling elderly faces engaged in what the marketing department probably called enriching activities. "You want me to leave my home?" It wasn't a question. I want you to face reality. You're 72, Mom. Living alone in a house this size isn't practical. What happens when you fall? When you can't manage the stairs? When your mind starts to go? Each question landed with calculated cruelty. This way, you'll have help. Medical care. And I won't have to worry about getting calls in the middle of the night. The middle of the night. As if she'd ever called him for anything. As if she'd ever been anything but completely self-sufficient. Managing every crisis on her own while he built his empire, and forgot he'd ever had a mother who'd sacrificed her teaching career to raise him. I need time to think, she said. You have until Friday. The new owners want to take possession next month. New owners? Marcus's smile was the same one he'd worn as a child when he'd broken something, and was trying to determine if the truth would serve him better than a lie. I'm selling. Real estate market's good right now. This place will bring in enough to cover your care for as long as necessary. The betrayal was so complete, so perfectly orchestrated, that for a moment Soliva couldn't breathe. He hadn't just taken her home. He'd turned her love for him into a financial transaction. Every sacrifice she'd made, every dream she'd deferred, every choice she'd made to put his needs first had led to this moment. Get out. The words surprised them both. Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him since he'd walked in. Excuse me? I said, get out. Soliva stood, her hands steady now, her voice carrying an authority she'd forgotten she possessed. Take your papers and your threats and get out of my house. It's not your house anymore, Mom. That's what I've been trying to explain. Then I suppose I have nothing left to lose. Something in her tone made Marcus pause. For just a moment, she saw a flicker of the boy who used to run to her when thunderstorms scared him, who'd once made her a Mother's Day card with crayon flowers and the words, "You're the best mom in the whole world," in his careful 7-year-old handwriting. But the moment passed. Friday, Mom. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. After he left, Soliva sat in the sudden silence, staring at the brochure he'd left behind. Meadowbrook Senior Living. Where dreams went to die in comfortable, organized shifts. She walked slowly to David's old study, the room she'd kept exactly as he'd left it. His books still lined the shelves, his reading glasses still sat on the desk, next to a photo of the three of them from Marcus's high school graduation. A lifetime ago, when they'd still been a family. The insurance policy documents were in the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, yellowed with age but still valid. $250,000, invested carefully over the years, now worth nearly $400,000. Enough for a new life, if she had the courage to claim it. Her laptop, a gift from Marcus 3 Christmases ago, back when he'd still gone through the motions of filial duty, sat dormant on the desk. She opened it with trembling fingers and waited for it to connect to the internet. Switzerland. The word appeared in the search bar as if her subconscious had been planning this moment for years. She'd always dreamed of seeing the Alps, of standing in a place where the world stretched out clean and white and infinite. David had promised they'd go someday, after Marcus was grown, after they'd saved enough, after life calmed down, after never came. But now, the village of Grindelwald appeared on her screen like a revelation. Chalets nestled against impossible mountains, their windows glowing warm against the snow. A place where an elderly American woman could disappear and reinvent herself, where no one would know she'd spent 50 years giving pieces of herself away until nothing remained. The booking took 20 minutes. Flight to Zurich, train to Grindelwald, a guest house called Alpenblick that promised comfort and discretion. The credit card transaction felt like signing a Declaration of Independence. When Marcus returned Friday morning, expecting to find her packed and compliant, he found instead an empty house and a note on the kitchen table. The house is yours, as you've made clear. I've gone to find a place where I'm actually wanted. Don't look for me. Mother! She was already over the Atlantic when he found it, watching the sun rise over an ocean that stretched toward a future she was finally brave enough to claim. Marcus's hand had been steady when he'd signed those transfer papers, but Soliva's trembled now as she gripped the airplane armrest, 37,000 feet above the Atlantic. The elderly woman in 14C, who'd been knitting peacefully for the past 6 hours, had fallen asleep. her needles still clutched in arthritic fingers that reminded Soliva too much of her own. The flight attendant, a young woman with kind eyes and the sort of patient smile that suggested she'd dealt with nervous elderly passengers before, paused beside her seat. "Can I get you anything, ma'am? We'll be beginning our descent into Zurich in about an hour." Zurich. The word still felt foreign on her tongue, like a language she'd never learned to speak. "I'm fine, thank you." But she wasn't fine. Every rational thought screamed that she'd made a catastrophic mistake. 72 years old, traveling alone to a country where she spoke perhaps 20 words of German, with no plan beyond a 3-week reservation at a guest house whose website she'd barely managed to navigate. What kind of woman abandons everything she's ever known based on a moment of wounded pride? The kind who'd spent 50 years being invisible, apparently. Her purse sat heavy in her lap, weighted with the envelope containing her liquidated savings. The process had been surprisingly simple. A few signatures, some paperwork, and suddenly decades of careful financial management had become a cashier's check made out to herself. The bank manager, a soft-spoken man about Marcus's age, had asked twice if she was certain about the large withdrawal. She'd lied smoothly, claiming it was for home renovations. He'd seemed relieved by the explanation, as if the alternative, that a grandmother might be planning something reckless and wonderful, was too unlikely to consider. Selling the car had been harder. David's 2015 Honda Civic, maintained with the obsessive care he'd brought to everything he'd loved. She'd driven it to the CarMax lot with her hands shaking, knowing that once she signed those papers, there would be no easy way back to her old life. The salesman had been efficient and kind, offering her a fair price without the condescension she'd expected. When he'd asked if she needed a ride home, she'd realized she was no longer sure where home was. Her jewelry had gone next. Her engagement ring, the pearl necklace David had given her for their 20th anniversary, the small collection of pieces she'd accumulated over the decades. Everything except her wedding band, which she couldn't bring herself to remove even now. The jeweler had been surprisingly generous, perhaps recognizing the quiet desperation behind her careful composure. Now, suspended between continents, Soliva wondered if this was how it felt to die. This strange combination of terror and liberation. The sense that everything familiar was falling away while something unknown rushed toward her. The plane shuddered slightly as it hit turbulence, and the woman beside her stirred, opening eyes the color of faded cornflowers. "Nervous about landing?" she asked in a voice touched with what might have been a German accent. "A little," Soliva admitted. "First time in Switzerland?" "Yes, first time. Anywhere, really." The admission felt shameful. How did you explain to a stranger that you'd spent 72 years in the same small orbit, never venturing beyond what was safe and expected? The woman smiled, and something in her expression reminded Soliva of her former students, the way children looked when they finally understood a concept they'd been struggling with. "Switzerland is a good place for first times. Very safe, very organized. Where are you going?" "Grindelwald." "Ah, beautiful, you will love it. The mountains." She gestured helplessly, as if words were inadequate to describe what awaited. "Have you been to mountains before?" Soliva shook her head. The highest elevation she'd ever experienced was the modest hills surrounding their hometown. Bumps in the landscape that had seemed significant at the time but now felt like practice for something grander. "Then you are in for a surprise. The Alps, they change you. Make you feel very small and very large at the same time." The woman's eyes twinkled. "My name is Greta. I live in Bern, but I have been visiting my daughter in Boston. Returning home after 3 weeks." Soliva. A beautiful name. Very unusual. "Are you traveling alone?" The question shouldn't have stung, but it did. "Yes." Greta studied her with the frankness that seemed to come with age. "You are brave. My husband, he would never let me travel so far alone. He thinks I will get lost, forget my passport, miss my flight." She laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Perhaps that is why I wanted to visit my daughter by myself this time." The plane began its descent, and through the small window, Soliva caught her first glimpse of Switzerland. The landscape below looked impossibly neat, as if someone had taken a map and made it real. Fields divided into perfect rectangles, Roads that curved with mathematical precision. Towns that looked like they'd been arranged by someone with an eye for beauty and order. "It looks like a fairy tale," she whispered. "Wait until you see the mountains," Greta said. The landing was smooth, efficient in the way Soliva was beginning to suspect everything Swiss would be. The airport was a marvel of glass and steel, filled with signs in multiple languages and travelers who moved with purpose through spaces that somehow managed to feel both grand and intimate. Customs was surprisingly simple. The officer, a young man with serious eyes and excellent English, stamped her passport and asked about the purpose of her visit. "Tourism," she said, though the word felt inadequate. "How long will you be staying?" "I'm not sure." The honesty surprised them both. He looked at her more carefully then, perhaps recognizing something in her face that suggested this wasn't an ordinary vacation. But he simply wished her a pleasant stay and waved her through. The train to Grindelwald was an education in Swiss efficiency. The ticket machine responded to English, the platform was clearly marked, and the train arrived exactly when promised. As they pulled away from Zurich, the landscape began to transform. Rolling hills gave way to steeper terrain, and gradually, impossibly, mountains began to rise around them. Soliva pressed her face to the window like a child, watching as the world outside became something from a postcard. Villages clung to hillsides like stubborn wildflowers, their churches pointing toward peaks that scraped the sky. Waterfalls tumbled down cliff faces, and everywhere she looked, the light seemed different. Cleaner, somehow, as if the air itself was polished. Other passengers spoke in hushed tones, their conversations a mixture of German, French, and languages she couldn't identify. She felt simultaneously invisible and hyper-aware, as if she was observing her own life from a great distance. The mountains grew taller as they climbed, until the train was threading its way through valleys that seemed carved by giants. And then, suddenly, they were there. "Grindelwald," the conductor announced, and Soliva's heart hammered against her ribs. She gathered her single suitcase and stepped onto the platform, immediately overwhelmed by the clarity of the air and the way the mountains seemed to press in from all sides. It was late afternoon, and the peaks caught the light like something sacred. A young man approached her, speaking rapid German. She shook her head helplessly, and he switched to English with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to confuse tourists. "You need directions?" "The Alpenblick guest house?" He pointed up a street that curved away from the station. 10 minutes walking. Very easy. But nothing about this felt easy. Each step away from the station was a step deeper into a life she didn't recognize as her own. The village was picture-perfect, all timber and flowers, and the sort of alpine charm that belonged in movies, not in the actual experience of a grandmother from Ohio who'd never been anywhere more exotic than Niagara Falls. The guest house, when she finally found it, was exactly as it had appeared on the website, a traditional chalet with carved wooden balconies and window boxes overflowing with geraniums. A small sign by the door read Alpenblick Pension in elegant script. Soliva stood on the threshold, her suitcase heavy in her hand, and realized that everything she'd ever been was on the other side of an ocean. Whatever happened next would be entirely up to her. For the first time in 50 years, the thought didn't terrify her. She opened the door and stepped into her new life. The door's heavy wooden handle turned with a satisfying click, and Soliva stepped into a lobby that smelled of lemon polish and something faintly floral. Perhaps the sachets of dried lavender she glimpsed in small bowls on antique side tables. The Alpenblick's interior was as meticulously maintained as its exterior, all dark wood paneling and brass fixtures that gleamed despite their obvious age. "Guten Tag," called a voice from behind a reception desk that looked like it had been carved from a single massive tree trunk. The woman who emerged was perhaps 60, with steel gray hair pulled into a neat bun and the sort of posture that suggested a lifetime of expecting things to be done properly. Her smile was polite but measured, the expression of someone sizing up a new arrival. "Hello?" Soliva replied, suddenly aware of how American her accent sounded in this space. "I have a reservation." "Turner?" The woman, her nameplate read Frau Zimmermann, consulted a leather-bound ledger with the deliberate movements of someone who had never quite trusted computers to manage important information. Ah, yes, 3 weeks. From America. She studied Soliva with frank curiosity. You are traveling alone? It was the second time in as many hours someone had asked that question. And Soliva felt a flush of embarrassment. Was it so obvious that she was out of place here? Yes. Very unusual. Most American tourists, they come in groups, or with family. Frau Zimmermann's tone carried no judgment, merely observation, but Soliva felt exposed nonetheless. The room was on the second floor, reached by stairs that creaked in a way that spoke of decades of guests climbing toward Alpine dreams. It was small but perfectly appointed, with a narrow bed covered in a quilt that looked hand-stitched, a writing desk positioned to catch the morning light, and windows that framed a view of the mountains so stunning it seemed almost aggressive in its beauty. Soliva set her suitcase on the luggage rack and sank into the single chair, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd done. 3 weeks ago, she'd been tending her garden in Ohio, worrying about whether the tomatoes would ripen before the first frost. Now she was staring at peaks that disappeared into clouds, in a country where she couldn't even ask for directions without fumbling through a translation app. Her first attempt at venturing into the village the next morning was a lesson in humility. The cashier's check in her purse represented her entire life's savings, but it might as well have been monopoly money for all the good it did her at the local bank. The young teller, crisp and professional in the way that seemed uniquely Swiss, explained in careful English that opening an account as a tourist was complicated. There were forms, requirements, residency documentation she didn't possess. But I have money, Soliva said, aware of how desperate she sounded. Quite a lot of money. The teller's smile was sympathetic but immovable. I understand, but without proper documentation. She trailed off, the implication clear. Switzerland's legendary banking system wasn't interested in accommodating an elderly American woman with no fixed address and a tourist visa. The municipal office was even worse. Located in a building that looked like it had been administering bureaucratic justice since the Middle Ages, it housed clerks who regarded her request for information about residency requirements with the sort of polite bewilderment usually reserved for people who asked where they might purchase a dragon. You wish to live here? The municipal clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the demeanor of someone who had spent his career saying no in multiple languages, reviewed her passport, as if it might reveal hidden secrets. In Grindelwald? I'm considering it. Are you employed here? Do you have family connections? A Swiss spouse? Each question was another door closing. No, and definitely no. Tourism is 90 days maximum, he informed her with the finality of someone reciting natural law. After that, you must leave Schengen area entirely. Return to America. Return to America. To what? Marcus had probably already changed the locks on the house that was no longer hers. Her few remaining friends were managing their own elderly parents, their own shrinking worlds. She'd severed her only remaining connection with such decisive finality that going back would mean admitting not just failure, but complete defeat. The grocery shopping expedition that afternoon provided a different sort of humiliation. The village market was a charming affair, with vendors who clearly took pride in their produce and artisanal cheeses. But Soliva's attempts to navigate the social rituals of Swiss commerce proved disastrous. She'd apparently violated some unspoken protocol by handling the apples before purchasing them, earning a sharp rebuke from the vendor in rapid German that needed no translation. Her attempt to apologize, Entschuldigung, one of the few words she'd memorized, only seemed to make things worse. The woman's expression suggested that Americans who couldn't be bothered to learn proper market etiquette had no business handling her carefully arranged fruit. By the time she returned to the guest house, Soliva's confidence had eroded like snow in spring rain. She sat in her small room as the Alpine sunset painted the mountains in shades of rose and gold, and for the first time since leaving Ohio, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she'd made a terrible mistake. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and for a wild moment she hoped it might be Marcus, perhaps having realized the magnitude of what he'd done. Instead, it was her cellular carrier, informing her that she'd exceeded her international data allowance and would be charged premium rates for further usage. Even her phone was abandoning her. The next few days blurred together in a haze of small defeats and mounting anxiety. She discovered that her favorite brand of tea wasn't available anywhere in the village. The shower in her room required a PhD in Swiss engineering to operate properly, alternating between Arctic cold and volcanic heat with no apparent middle ground. The laundry facilities were communal and came with instructions posted entirely in German, leading to an incident with fabric softener that left her traveling clothes smelling vaguely of industrial pine cleaner. But it was the stares that wore on her most. Not hostile exactly, but persistently curious. Grindelwald was clearly accustomed to tourists, but most stayed for a few days or perhaps a week. Soliva had been there nearly 10 days, and the locals had begun to notice. She caught whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, saw the way shop owners' eyes followed her with the sort of attention usually reserved for potential shoplifters. The language barrier made everything exponentially more difficult. Her high school German had dissolved into forgotten fragments, leaving her capable of ordering coffee and saying please and thank you, but unable to engage in the sort of conversation that might help her understand the rhythms of village life. She felt like a ghost haunting the edges of a community she couldn't quite reach. On her 10th evening, as she sat in her room picking at a dinner of bread and cheese she'd purchased from the friendliest vendor she could find, Soliva confronted the possibility that her grand gesture of independence might have been nothing more than the delusion of a foolish old woman. Marcus had been right about one thing. She was 72 years old, alone in a foreign country, with no plan beyond a vague hope that courage might somehow transform itself into wisdom. Her savings were substantial but not infinite. The guest house was costing her nearly $200 a night, and without the ability to open a local bank account or establish any sort of legal residency, she was essentially an expensive tourist playing at being an expatriate. She pulled out her phone and stared at Marcus's contact information for a long time. It would be so easy to call, to admit defeat, to ask for help getting home. He'd probably enjoy her capitulation, might even be gracious about it in the way people were when their predictions proved correct. But, as she sat there, finger hovering over his number, Soliva caught sight of herself in the mirror on the opposite wall. The woman looking back at her was thinner than she'd been in Ohio, her hair slightly disheveled from the mountain wind, her clothes wrinkled from hand-washing in the tiny sink. But there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, alertness, a presence that suggested engagement with her own life rather than mere endurance of it. She put the phone away without making the call. Tomorrow, she decided, she would find a way to make this work. She'd taught elementary school for 15 years before Marcus was born. Surely that had given her some problem-solving skills that could be applied to the challenge of building a life in Switzerland. She'd managed teenage Marcus through his father's death and his own subsequent rebellion. She'd maintained a house, a budget, a marriage, and her sanity through decades of ordinary crises. How different could it be to figure out Swiss bureaucracy? Outside her window, the mountains stood silent and eternal against the star-filled sky, indifferent to her struggles, but somehow reassuring in their permanence. They'd been here long before her problems existed, and they'd remain long after she'd solved them. She just had to figure out how. The mountains offered no answers in the pale morning light, but they provided something almost as valuable: perspective. Soliva dressed carefully in her most presentable traveling clothes and descended to the guest house's breakfast room with the determined air of someone who had made peace with the impossibility of her situation and decided to proceed anyway. Frau Zimmermann was arranging fresh rolls in a basket when Soliva appeared, and something in the older woman's expression suggested she'd been observing her American guest struggles with more interest than her professional demeanor usually allowed. "The weather, it will be changing today," she said without preamble, gesturing toward windows that framed a sky growing increasingly gray. "Rain coming from the west. You should perhaps stay inside, or find somewhere warm to wait." It was the first unsolicited advice Soliva had received since arriving, and she found herself unreasonably grateful for it. "Is there somewhere in the village?" Café Alpenrose. Ingrid makes the best coffee, and she speaks English very well. From the university, before. Frau Zimmermann's tone carried a weight of untold stories. She understands about changes in life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sky opened just as Soliva reached the village center. Fat raindrops that quickly became a steady downpour. She ducked into the first warm-looking establishment she could find, pushing through a door, marked with a hand-painted sign that read, Café Alpenrose, in cheerful blue letters. The interior was everything a proper Alpine cafe should be. Low wooden beams, checkered tablecloths, and windows fogged with steam from the espresso machine. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 45, with honey-colored hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and laugh lines that suggested she found more joy in life than sadness. She looked up as Soliva entered, and her smile was immediate and genuine. "You look like you need rescuing from this weather," she said in English accented with just a hint of German formality. "Coffee? Tea? Something to warm you up?" "Coffee would be wonderful." Soliva slid into a corner booth, grateful to be somewhere that felt genuinely welcoming. "Are you Ingrid? Guilty as charged." The woman moved around the counter with the easy efficiency of someone completely comfortable in her domain. "And you're the American staying at Zimmerman's place. The whole village has been wondering about you." Soliva felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Is it that obvious? I don't belong here?" Ingrid's laugh was warm and entirely without mockery. "Obvious? No, but Grindelwald is small enough that a new face becomes interesting very quickly, especially one that stays longer than a few days." She set down a cup of coffee that smelled like heaven and slid into the seat across from Soliva with the easy familiarity of someone who had never met a stranger. "I'm Ingrid Muller, and you're clearly someone with a story." Something in her tone, curious but not invasive, interested without being pushy, opened a floodgate Soliva hadn't realized was straining against pressure. "I'm Soliva Turner, and I think I may have made the worst decision of my life." "Ah," Ingrid said, as if this explained everything. "Running from something or running to something?" "Both. Neither. I'm not sure anymore." The coffee was excellent, rich and complex in a way that made the instant coffee she'd been drinking in her room seem like a poor joke. Soliva found herself telling Ingrid about Marcus, about the house, about the impossible impulsiveness that had brought her across an ocean with no plan beyond escape. Ingrid listened with the sort of attention that suggested she was familiar with stories of women reinventing themselves against impossible odds. When Soliva finished, the cafe owner was quiet for a moment, absently cleaning an already spotless espresso cup. "How old were you when you got married?" she finally asked. 22. "Children right away?" Marcus came along 2 years later. "So you've been someone's something. Wife, mother, caregiver for 50 years. Ingrid set down the cup and looked directly at Soliva. "And now, for the first time since you were 22, you're just yourself. That's terrifying." The simple acknowledgement of her fear was somehow more comforting than any reassurance could have been. The cafe door chimed, bringing with it a gust of rain-scented air and a man who looked like he'd been carved from the mountains themselves. Tall and broad-shouldered, with gray hair that suggested he was somewhere in his 60s, and hands that spoke of a lifetime of careful work. His expression was thunderous as he approached the counter. "Ingrid, you need to speak to the municipal office about these tourists," he said in English, heavily accented with Swiss German. "Another one blocked my driveway this morning. Completely inconsiderate." "Klaus Weber, meet Soliva Turner," Ingrid said with the air of someone performing a social experiment. "Soliva, this is Klaus. He's our village's official complainer about tourists, among other things." Klaus turned to study Soliva with eyes the color of alpine ice, and she felt herself being catalogued and found wanting. Tourist. American. Probably inconsiderate by definition. "You are staying long?" His tone suggested he hoped the answer was no. "I'm not sure," Soliva replied, lifting her chin slightly. "It depends on whether I can figure out how to make it work." Something in her tone made Klaus's eyebrows rise. "Make what work?" "Living here. Permanently." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of rain against the windows and the distant rumble of thunder. Klaus and Ingrid exchanged a look that spoke of years of friendship and the sort of communication that didn't require words. "You have residency permission?" Klaus asked, his tone softer now, more curious than confrontational. "Not yet. I'm still figuring out the requirements." "It's complicated," he said, which she was beginning to understand was Swiss for nearly impossible. Soliva fumbled in her purse for her phone, intending to show them the translation app she'd been using to navigate basic conversations, but her fingers found instead the small wristwatch David had given her for their 10th anniversary. It was a delicate thing, with a face no bigger than a quarter, and a band that had stretched over the years to accommodate her changing wrists. As she pulled it out, the watch face separated cleanly from the band, tiny gears and springs scattering across the table like mechanical tears. "Oh," she said, staring at the destruction of one of her last tangible connections to her former life. "Oh no." Klaus leaned forward, examining the damage with the focused attention of someone who understood the intricate relationships between small, precise things. "This is good watch. Swiss movement. Very repairable." "You know about watches?" "I am watchmaker. Was watchmaker. Retired now, but—" He gathered the scattered pieces with surprising gentleness. "This can be fixed. Not expensive. Maybe 40 francs. The kindness in his voice was unexpected, and Soliva felt tears threaten for the first time since arriving in Switzerland. "That's very kind of you." "Is not kindness. Is just what broken things need. Attention. Care. Someone who understands how they work." Ingrid was watching this exchange with the pleased expression of someone whose social experiment was exceeding expectations. "Klaus, since you're being helpful, maybe you could explain to Soliva about the residency requirements? Your English is better than the municipal clerk's." Klaus glanced between the two women, clearly recognizing that he was being maneuvered into something. "Is complicated," he said again, but with less conviction. "Everything's complicated until someone explains it properly," Ingrid replied. "And Soliva, I have a proposition for you." Soliva looked up from the scattered watch pieces, afraid to hope. "My English is good, but I have customers, tourists mostly, who would prefer to practice with a native speaker. And I could use help during the busy season. Part-time work, nothing official, but enough to keep you busy and give you a reason to stay while you figure out the paperwork." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Soliva felt momentarily dizzy. "You don't even know me." "I know enough." Ingrid's smile was warm but practical. "I know you're brave enough to start over at 72. I know you're polite enough to apologize for taking shelter from rain in my cafe. And I know you need help, and I happen to be in a position to provide it." Klaus was still examining the watch pieces, but Soliva could tell he was listening to every word. "The municipal office," he said without looking up. "They are more helpful when someone local accompanies the application. Translation, you understand. Cultural context. It wasn't exactly an offer, but it wasn't a refusal either." "Why?" Soliva asked, looking between these two strangers, who were offering her more practical assistance than she'd received from her own son in decades. "Why would you help me?" Ingrid's expression grew thoughtful. "Because sometimes people need a place to land while they figure out how to fly. And sometimes small villages need reminding that the world is bigger and more interesting than we pretend." Klaus finally looked up from the watch pieces. "And sometimes," he said quietly, "fixing things that seem broken beyond repair is exactly what we need to remember how to do." Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, but Soliva no longer felt any urgency to venture back into it. For the first time since arriving in Switzerland, she was exactly where she needed to be. 3 weeks later, Soliva stood behind the counter of Café Alpenrose, measuring coffee beans, with the sort of precision Klaus had taught her was essential to Swiss life. The morning ritual had become as natural as breathing. Unlock the café at 7, start the first batch of coffee, arrange the pastries Ingrid picked up from the bakery each dawn, and prepare for the steady stream of locals who had begun to accept her presence as part of the village's daily rhythm. "Guten Morgen, Frau Turner," called Herr Fischer, the elderly man who arrived every morning at precisely 7:15 for his double espresso and 20 minutes of contemplative silence. He'd been the first to acknowledge her with anything approaching warmth, and his careful pronunciation of her name felt like a small daily victory. "Guten Morgen, Herr Fischer," she replied, proud that her accent had improved enough that she no longer winced at her own pronunciation. "Wie gewöhnlich." "Ja, bit." His smile suggested approval of her linguistic progress. The morning German lesson Ingrid had instituted was paying dividends in small but meaningful ways. Soliva could now navigate basic conversations about weather, coffee preferences, and polite inquiries about health and family. More importantly, she was beginning to understand the rhythms of Swiss communication, the careful pauses, the understated humor, the way important information was often conveyed through what wasn't said rather than what was. Klaus appeared just as she was finishing Herr Fischer's order, carrying her watch in a small velvet pouch with the reverence of someone returning a rescued bird to flight. Over the past weeks, he'd become a regular fixture in the café, ostensibly to check on her progress with the municipal paperwork. But increasingly, Soliva suspected, because he enjoyed having somewhere to go that didn't echo with memories. "Your timepiece," he announced formally, then broke into the shy smile that transformed his entire face. "Good as new. Better, maybe." I replaced the mainspring. Soliva accepted the watch with hands that trembled slightly. The face gleamed, the intricate hands moved with smooth precision, and when she held it to her ear, the steady tick was like a heartbeat returning to life. "Klaus, I can't thank you enough. What do I owe you?" "Nothing. Was pleasure to work on something so well made." He paused, studying her face. "Your husband, he had good taste in watches. And wives." It was the first time he'd acknowledged David directly, and Soliva felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee she was preparing. "He would have liked you. He appreciated craftsmen." "Perhaps we would have been friends," Klaus said quietly. "Good men. They recognize each other." Ingrid bustled in from the storage room, her arms full of fresh linens and her expression bright with the particular energy that suggested she was planning something. "Perfect timing. I have news. Father Benedict has invited us all to dinner Sunday evening. Apparently he's heard about our American edition and wants to meet the woman who's got Klaus voluntarily translating municipal documents." "I don't voluntarily," Klaus began, but his protest lacked conviction. "And Dr. Chen will be there too. She specifically asked to meet you, Soliva." Dr. Sarah Chen had become something of a legend in Soliva's mind over the past weeks. An American expatriate who'd arrived 15 years ago and somehow navigated the labyrinthine process of Swiss residency with such success that she now served as an unofficial consultant for other foreigners attempting the same feat. Ingrid had mentioned her several times, always with the sort of respect reserved for someone who had achieved the impossible. "She really wants to meet me? She's curious about another American woman brave enough to start over here. Says it's a rare breed." Ingrid's smile carried a hint of mischief. "I heard from my grandson last night. He wants to talk." "Ah." Ingrid's tone carried a wealth of understanding. "And you're terrified of what he might say. Terrified of what I might have to explain." Soliva abandoned the espresso machine and sank into one of the cafe's worn wooden chairs. "I left without telling him he's 17, Ingrid. His parents are divorced, his world is falling apart, and his grandmother just disappeared." Klaus chose that moment to arrive, bringing with him the crisp mountain air and an expression that suggested he'd sensed disturbance in the careful equilibrium they'd all been building. He took one look at Soliva's face and settled into the chair across from her, without his usual preliminary complaints about tourist traffic or weather patterns. "Bad news from home?" he asked quietly. "Complicated news." Soliva pulled out her phone and showed them Thomas's message. "I don't know how to respond." "Perhaps," Klaus said after a moment of consideration, "you start with the truth, that you are safe, that you think of him, and that you were afraid but you are learning not to be. He'll want to know why I left. Then you tell him, not everything at once, maybe, but enough so he understands you did not leave him. You left a situation that was making you disappear. Ingrid nodded emphatically. Klaus is right. Children, even almost adult children, are more resilient than we think. They can handle truth better than they can handle silence. That afternoon, alone in her guesthouse room with the door locked and her nerves strung tight as violin strings, Soliva typed a response. Thomas, I'm safe and well. I'm living in Switzerland now, in a beautiful mountain village. It's complicated, but I needed to start over somewhere I could breathe. Can we talk? I've missed you more than you know. His response came within minutes. Video call? I'm on break from school. Need to see your face and make sure you're really okay. The video call connected with Thomas sitting in what looked like a college dorm room, though she knew he was still in high school. He'd grown taller in the months since she'd seen him, his face losing the last softness of childhood and settling into features that reminded her painfully of Marcus at that age, before disappointment and resentment had hardened him into someone she barely recognized. Grandmother. Thomas's voice cracked slightly on the word, and she could see the careful control he was exercising to keep his emotions in check. Everyone's been looking for you. Dad hired a private investigator. Oh, Thomas! The guilt hit her like a physical blow. I'm so sorry. I never meant to worry you. Are you really okay? Like, really? His eyes, David's eyes, she realized with a start, searched her face through the screen. Because you look different. Good different, but different. Soliva glanced around her small room, seeing it suddenly through his eyes. The mountain view, the simple furnishings, the peace that had begun to settle into her features over the past weeks. I am okay. Better than I've been in a long time, actually. Dad said you had some kind of breakdown. That you were confused, maybe not thinking clearly. The anger that rose in her throat was swift and hot, but she tamped it down. This wasn't Thomas's fault. Your father and I had a disagreement about my living situation. A serious one. I decided I needed some distance to figure things out. He kicked you out of the house, didn't he? Thomas's voice was flat. Matter of fact in the way that suggested he'd pieced together more of the truth than Marcus had probably intended. I found the legal papers he left on his desk. The deed transfer. Soliva closed her eyes, then opened them to meet his gaze directly. Yes. God. Thomas ran his hands through hair that was darker than Marcus's but carried the same stubborn cowlick. I knew things were bad between you two, but I didn't think. I mean, it's your house. Was my house. But Thomas, that's not why I called you back. I called because I love you, and because I was afraid you'd think I'd abandoned you. Did you? The question was quiet, vulnerable in the way only teenagers could be when they stopped pretending to be adults. No, never. I abandoned a situation that was making me smaller every day, but I would never abandon you. Soliva leaned closer to the camera, wishing she could reach through the screen. Tell me about you. How's school? Are you still drawing? Thomas's face brightened with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. Actually, that's part of why I was looking for you. I got accepted to art school. In Florence. Plus, she's the only person I know who managed to get permanent residency without marrying a Swiss citizen or having a prearranged job. If anyone can help you navigate the bureaucracy, it's Sarah. Sunday dinner at Father Benedict's turned out to be an education in the sort of community Soliva had never realized she was missing. The priest's modest apartment above the village church was warm and inviting, filled with books in multiple languages and artwork that suggested extensive travel. Father Benedict himself was a revelation. Not the solemn cleric she'd expected, but a man in his early 60s with laugh lines around his eyes and the sort of easy humor that put everyone immediately at ease. So you're the mysterious American who's got our Klaus fixing watches again, he said as he welcomed her with a firm handshake and twinkling eyes. I was beginning to think he'd forgotten how to do anything but complain about tourists. Dr. Sarah Chen was not what Soliva had imagined either. Compact and precise, with graying hair cut in a no-nonsense bob, and the sort of direct gaze that suggested she was accustomed to cutting through ambiguity to reach practical solutions. She wore jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Soliva's monthly guesthouse bill, and when she smiled, it was with the confidence of someone who had learned to trust her own judgment above all else. "Ingrid tells me you've decided to become Swiss," Sarah said without preamble as they settled around Benedict's dining table. "That takes either tremendous courage or spectacular delusion. I'm curious which one it is." "Probably both," Soliva admitted, earning appreciative laughter from the group. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Soliva had experienced in decades. These people talked about ideas, about choices, about the deliberate construction of lives that reflected their values rather than their circumstances. Klaus, it turned out, had been married for 42 years before his wife's death from cancer 3 years earlier. "Anna, she was the social one," he said, his voice careful but steady. "Always organizing dinners, bringing people together. After she died, I thought that part of life was finished for me." "But it wasn't," Ingrid said gently. "No, but it needed renovation. Like old watch that still has good movement but needs new case." He glanced at Soliva. "Sometimes broken things just need different kind of care than they had before." Ingrid's story emerged more gradually, woven through the evening's conversation like a thread that gradually revealed the pattern of the whole cloth. Her marriage had ended not in death but in something more complicated. Years of careful diminishment that had left her feeling like a ghost in her own life. "I told myself it was normal," she said, refilling wine glasses with the automatic gesture of someone comfortable playing hostess. "The way he needed to know where I was every moment, who I talked to, what I spent money on. I thought it meant he loved me." "But it didn't," Sarah said, her tone matter-of-fact, rather than sympathetic. "No. It meant he was afraid. And his fear was eating both of us alive." Ingrid's smile was rueful. "So I left. Took my daughter and came here to start the cafe. Scariest thing I'd ever done, until Soliva showed up and made you feel like a coward for only moving 2 cantons away," Benedict said with gentle humor. Sarah's story was different but related. A successful medical career in Boston that had consumed her 20s and 30s until she realized she was living someone else's definition of success. "I had everything I was supposed to want," she said. "Partnership in a prestigious practice, apartment on Beacon Hill, social connections that opened every door in the city. And I was miserable, absolutely profoundly miserable." "So you moved to Switzerland to practice medicine?" Soliva asked. "I moved to Switzerland to remember what it felt like to choose my own life. The medical practice came later, after I'd figured out who I actually was when nobody was watching." Father Benedict's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. A successful businessman who'd spent 20 years building a consulting firm before what he called his spiritual awakening led him to seminary at age 45. "My wife thought I'd lost my mind," he admitted. "She wasn't entirely wrong. Sometimes losing your mind is exactly what you need to find your soul." As the evening progressed, Soliva realized that each of these people had done what she was attempting. They'd recognized that their lives had become something other than what they wanted, and had possessed the courage to change course. The difference was that they'd been younger when they'd made their leaps, with more time to recover from potential mistakes. "The residency process is complex but not impossible," Sarah said as the evening wound down. "The key is demonstrating that you can support yourself and that you're committed to integrating into Swiss society. Your work with Ingrid helps with both requirements." "How long does it take?" "For permanent residency, typically 10 to 12 years of continuous residence. But there are shorter-term options that can get you stable status while you work toward the long-term goal." 10 to 12 years. Soliva would be in her 80s by the time she could call herself truly Swiss. The timeline should have been daunting, but instead she felt oddly comforted by its scope. It suggested a future that extended beyond mere survival, a reason to plan and hope and invest in tomorrow. "The first step is getting your temporary residence permit extended," Sarah continued. "That requires proving you can support yourself financially and that you have legitimate reasons for staying. Klaus can help with the municipal paperwork, and I can connect you with an immigration lawyer who specializes in American cases." As they prepared to leave, Benedict pulled Soliva aside. "I hope you'll consider joining us for English language services," he said. We have a small but enthusiastic congregation of expatriates and locals who want to practice their English. It's informal, but it might help you feel more connected to the community. Walking back through the village in the mountain darkness, with Klaus on one side and Ingrid on the other, Soliva felt something she hadn't experienced since David's death: the sense of belonging to something larger than her own immediate concerns. These people had chosen her, had welcomed her into their circle not because they had to, but because they wanted to. "Thank you," she said as they reached the guest house. "For dinner, for everything." "Is what community does," Klaus said simply. "We take care of each other." It wasn't until she was alone in her room, preparing for bed with movements that had become routine over the past month, that Soliva realized the transformation that had occurred. She was no longer a refugee from her old life. She was becoming the architect of a new one. Her phone buzzed with a message notification, and for a moment she considered ignoring it. But as she reached to turn off the bedside lamp, curiosity won. The message was from Facebook, from an account she barely remembered having. Thomas Turner had sent her a friend request, along with a message that made her breath catch in her throat. "Grandmother, I've been looking for you everywhere. We need to talk." Soliva stared at the phone screen until the words blurred, her heart hammering against her ribs with the irregular rhythm of panic mixed with longing. Thomas. Her grandson, whose childhood she'd helped shape with bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes, whose artwork still decorated the refrigerator in a house that was no longer hers. The boy who'd grown into someone she barely knew, caught in the crossfire of his parents, dysfunction, and her own cowardly escape. She set the phone on the nightstand without responding, but sleep became impossible. Through her window, the mountains stood sentinel against a star-scattered sky, indifferent to her turmoil. She'd spent 6 weeks building a new life, carefully constructing a sense of belonging that felt as fragile as the alpine flowers that bloomed in brief, brilliant defiance of the harsh climate. Thomas's message threatened all of it. By morning, she'd composed and deleted a dozen responses, each one feeling either too much or too little. How did you explain to your 17-year-old grandson that you'd abandoned everything familiar because his father had finally pushed you past the breaking point of maternal endurance? How did you justify running away without even saying goodbye? The cafe provided temporary refuge. The familiar morning ritual, grinding coffee, arranging pastries, greeting the regulars who'd begun to accept her as part of the village's daily rhythm, offered structure for her scattered thoughts. But Ingrid noticed immediately. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, studying Soliva's face with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read emotional weather patterns in others. "Something like that." Soliva fumbled with the espresso machine, her usually steady hands betraying her. "Florence? Italy? Yeah. It's this incredible program. Renaissance art techniques, classical training, but with contemporary applications. I sent them my portfolio last year, never thought I'd actually get in, but..." He shrugged, trying to appear casual about what was clearly a monumental achievement. "Thomas, that's wonderful!" The pride in her voice was unmistakable. "Your grandfather would be so proud. He always said you had his artistic eye." "Dad doesn't want me to go. Says it's impractical. That I should focus on something with better career prospects. Business, maybe. Something useful." The bitterness in his voice was all too familiar. "And what do you want?" "I want to go. I want to learn how to paint like the masters did. Want to understand light and color and proportion the way they did. I want..." He paused, struggling to articulate something that was clearly central to his sense of self. "I want to create something beautiful, something that matters." "Then you should go." "Really?" His surprise was heartbreaking. "You don't think it's a waste of time?" "I think pursuing your passion is never a waste of time. I think your grandfather would have said the same thing." Soliva's voice grew firm. "And I think you're brave to know what you want at 17. It took me 72 years to figure that out." They talked for over an hour, the conversation ranging from his art to her new life in Switzerland, to the careful navigation of family politics that had become his daily reality. She told him about Ingrid and Klaus, about the cafe and the mountains, and the slow process of learning to belong somewhere new. He told her about his portfolio, his hopes for Florence, and the loneliness of being caught between parents who seemed more interested in winning their ongoing conflict than in understanding their son. "He asks about you sometimes," Thomas said as their conversation wound down. "Dad, I mean. He tries to act like he doesn't care, but he does. He's just, I don't know, angry all the time. He has a right to be angry with me." "Does he? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like he pushed away the one person who always had his back, and now he's surprised that she's not there anymore." The insight was so mature, so clear-eyed, that Soliva felt a surge of pride mixed with sadness. Thomas was becoming the man Marcus might have been if grief and resentment hadn't twisted him into someone she barely recognized. "I love your father," she said carefully. "But love doesn't mean accepting treatment that makes you disappear. I hope someday he'll understand that." "Maybe he will. He's been different since Mom moved out, quieter. Like he's finally starting to think about things instead of just reacting to them." After they hung up, Soliva sat in the gathering dusk, processing the complex emotions their conversation had stirred. Relief that Thomas didn't hate her, pride in his accomplishments and his clear sense of his own path, guilt about the pain her absence had caused, and underneath it all, a stubborn core of certainty that she'd made the right choice, even if the execution had been messier than she'd intended. A soft knock at her door interrupted her reverie. Klaus stood in the hallway, holding 2 cups of tea and wearing the expression of someone who'd appointed himself guardian of her emotional well-being. "Ingrid thought you might need company," he said simply. She accepted the tea gratefully and gestured him toward the room's single chair while she settled on the bed. For several minutes they sat in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the mountain peaks. "Good talk with your grandson?" Klaus asked eventually. "Better than I expected. He's remarkable. Accepted to art school in Florence. Ah, artist in the family. Like his grandfather." Soliva smiled, remembering David's weekend sketching expeditions, the way his face would light up when he captured exactly the effect he'd been seeking. His father doesn't approve. Fathers often fear their children will make the same mistakes they did. Sometimes they forget that following your heart is not always a mistake. Klaus's words carried the weight of personal experience, and Soliva found herself curious about the stories he hadn't yet told. But before she could ask, he continued. "Your grandson, he will come to visit?" "I hope so. He mentioned that Florence isn't far from here, geographically speaking. We would welcome him. Artists, they understand about seeing things differently, about having courage to show the world what others might miss." The simple acceptance in his voice, the assumption that her family would naturally be welcomed into the community she was building, brought tears to her eyes. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a woman with no home and no prospects. Now she was someone whose grandson would be welcomed by people who cared about her happiness. "Thomas said his father is looking for me," she said quietly. Klaus nodded, unsurprised. "You knew he would eventually." "I'm not ready to talk to him." "Then you wait until you are ready, or until he proves he is ready to listen instead of just talk." Klaus set down his empty teacup and studied her face. "You are not the same woman who arrived 6 weeks ago. You have found your feet here. When the time comes to face your son, you will face him as yourself, not as the person he expected you to remain." After Klaus left, Soliva opened her laptop and began typing an email to Thomas, outlining the practical steps for applying for a student visa, offering to help research housing options in Florence, and promising to visit him there once he was settled. She was still his grandmother, even if she was no longer the woman who'd raised his father. Perhaps she could be a better one now, someone who encouraged his dreams instead of teaching him to sacrifice them for other people's comfort. Outside her window, the mountains stood eternal and indifferent, but somehow reassuring in their permanence. Whatever storms were coming, she would weather them from a position of strength rather than submission. She'd learned to belong somewhere new. Now she would learn whether the family she'd left behind was capable of accepting the woman she was becoming. The morning started like any other, Soliva unlocking the cafe doors at precisely 7 o'clock, the familiar ritual of grinding beans and arranging pastries providing the comforting structure that had become her anchor in this new life. The Alpine air carried its usual crisp promise of autumn, and the first regulars were already making their way down the cobblestone street toward their daily doses of caffeine and community. She was behind the counter, steam wand in hand, when the door chimed to admit what she initially took to be just another tourist. Tall, well-dressed, with the slightly disoriented expression of someone still adjusting to the time change. It wasn't until he turned fully toward the counter that recognition hit her like a physical blow. Marcus. Her son stood in the doorway of Café Alpenrose looking exactly like what he was, a successful American businessman who'd traveled a very long way to retrieve something he considered his property. His charcoal suit was wrinkled from travel, his usually perfect hair showed signs of airplane sleep, but his expression carried the same determined authority she'd last seen in her kitchen in Ohio. The espresso cup in Soliva's hand slipped, shattering against the floor in a spray of porcelain and coffee that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Every conversation in the cafe stopped. Herr Fischer looked up from his newspaper. The young couple at the corner table turned to stare. Even the espresso machine seemed to hold its breath. "Hello, Mother." His voice carried across the small space with the same carefully controlled tone he'd used to deliver his ultimatum 2 months ago. Professional. Measured. Designed to establish dominance through sheer force of certainty. Marcus. Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, and she hated herself for it. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you. Obviously." He stepped further into the cafe, his gaze sweeping the rustic interior, with the sort of assessment that found everything wanting. "Nice place you found to have your breakdown." The casual cruelty of it, delivered in front of people who'd become her community, her chosen family, sparked something that had been building in Soliva for weeks. She straightened, drawing on the strength she'd discovered in herself since arriving in Switzerland. "I'm not having a breakdown. I'm having a life." Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly, perhaps surprised by the firmness in her voice. "You disappeared without a trace. Left a passive-aggressive note and vanished to a foreign country. If that's not a breakdown, what would you call it?" "I'd call it making a choice." Soliva was aware of the cafe, Mia's other patrons listening, but she no longer cared. "Something I should have done years ago." "You're 72 years old, Mom. Living in some fantasy where you can just reinvent yourself because you didn't like my solution to your housing situation." "Your solution?" The words came out louder than she'd intended. "Your solution was to steal my house and warehouse me in a facility so you could sell everything I'd built and pocket the money." The ugly truth, spoken aloud in this place that had become sacred to her, hung in the air like smoke. She could see Herr Fischer's shocked expression, the way the young couple exchanged meaningful glances. This was not how Swiss people conducted family business, with raised voices and public accusations in spaces meant for community comfort. The door chimed again, and Klaus entered with his usual morning gruffness, stopping short when he took in the scene. His gaze moved from Soliva's flushed face to Marcus's defensive posture, and his expression shifted into something protective and slightly dangerous. "Problem?" he asked quietly, but his tone suggested he was prepared to make Marcus's presence a very uncomfortable one if necessary. "Klaus, this is my son, Marcus." "Marcus, this is Klaus Weber. He's been helping me with local matters." Klaus studied Marcus with the sort of assessment usually reserved for damaged timepieces, examining the surface for clues about what might be broken underneath. "You are the son who put his mother out of her home." It wasn't a question, and Marcus's flush suggested Klaus's reputation for direct speech had preceded him. "That's a mischaracterization of, is accurate characterization," Klaus interrupted. "Your mother, she told us what happened. We help her because she deserves better treatment than her own family gives." The door chimed a third time, and Ingrid hurried in, clearly having been summoned by some invisible village communication network that had identified a crisis in progress. She took one look at the tableau and immediately moved to Soliva's side, her presence both supportive and subtly confrontational. "You must be Marcus," she said in English that carried just enough German accent to remind him he was the outsider here. "I am Ingrid Muller. I own this cafe." "I'd like to speak with my mother privately," Marcus said, his tone attempting to reassert control. "Your mother is working. Ingrid replied smoothly. "And this is place of business. If you wish private conversation, perhaps you make appointment." The subtle humiliation of being managed by Soliva's new friends clearly stung. Marcus's jaw tightened in the way that had preceded his worst childhood tantrums. But he was smart enough to recognize that he was outnumbered and operating on foreign ground. "Fine. When do you get off work, Mom?" The question was simple enough, but it carried an assumption that made Soliva's teeth clench. That her work here was somehow temporary, a childish game she'd abandon once he explained reality to her properly. That she was still the woman who'd rearranged her entire life around his convenience. "I don't get off work today," she said quietly, "but Father Benedict opens the church for private conversation if you're genuinely interested in talking rather than just delivering ultimatums." An hour later, they sat in the small stone church that had become Soliva's weekly refuge, the silence heavy with decades of unspoken resentment and misunderstanding. Father Benedict had offered them the space with the gentle suggestion that some conversations required sacred ground to be conducted properly, then positioned himself in the rectory close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough to allow privacy. Marcus looked profoundly uncomfortable in the pew, his expensive suit and atheistic certainty at odds with the humble sanctuary. Soliva, by contrast, felt anchored by the familiar peace she'd discovered during her weekly English-language services. "This is insane, Mom, you know that, right?" Marcus's voice was quieter now but no less certain. "You can't just run away to Switzerland because we had a disagreement about your living situation." "We didn't have a disagreement. You informed me that you'd stolen my house and were having me institutionalized." Soliva's voice remained level, but she could feel the anger that had sustained her journey beginning to crystallize into something clearer. "There's a difference. I didn't steal anything. The house should have been transferred to me when Dad died. I was just correcting a legal oversight. That legal oversight was called trust. I trusted you to understand that the house was still my home, even if your father's name was on the deed." She turned to face him directly. "I was wrong to trust you." Marcus flinched as if she'd struck him. For a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked, and she caught a glimpse of something raw underneath. Pain, perhaps, or the kind of guilt that had been eating at him for longer than he'd admit. "You want to know the truth?" His voice was rougher now, less controlled. "The truth is that I've been angry with you for 37 years. Angry about the way you made Dad's death all about your grief, all about your sacrifice. Angry about the way you turned yourself into this perpetual martyr who gave up everything for me, like I was supposed to spend my entire life feeling guilty about it." The accusation hit her like a physical blow, but beneath the pain was recognition. "So you decided to punish me. I decided to solve a problem. You were alone in a house too big for you, with no real income, except what I sent you. It wasn't sustainable. What wasn't sustainable was living with your resentment, feeling like a burden to my own son, watching you turn into someone I didn't recognize. I turned into a successful man. Everything you said you wanted for me. I wanted you to be happy. I wanted you to be kind. I wanted you to remember that love isn't supposed to come with receipts and resentment attached." Soliva's voice broke slightly. "I failed at teaching you those things, and that's on me. But I won't let your failure to understand love destroy what's left of my life." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of spoken truths settling between them like dust after an explosion. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice smaller than she'd heard it since childhood. "I don't know how to not be angry with you." "Then maybe that's something you need to figure out with a professional. Because I can't fix what your grief broke 37 years ago. You could come home, we could work on it together. Home is here now. I found people who value me for who I am, not who they need me to be." Soliva stood, suddenly exhausted by the familiar dynamic they kept falling into. "You're welcome to visit, to be part of my life. But only if you can accept that I'm not coming back to be your victim." She was halfway to the door when Marcus called out, his voice cracking with something that might have been genuine distress. "Thomas is coming." Soliva turned back, alarmed. "What do you mean?" "He found out I was here, bought a ticket to Zurich. He'll be here tomorrow." Marcus's expression was complicated, mixing frustration with something that looked like fear. He says we need to work this out like adults before he goes to Florence. The idea of Thomas inserting himself into this minefield of family dysfunction made her stomach clench. You should have told him to stay home. I tried. He said he was 18 in 3 months and could make his own decisions. Reminded me that I couldn't control him the way I... Marcus stopped, the implication hanging between them. The way you controlled me. Yeah. For the first time since he'd walked into her cafe, Marcus looked genuinely uncertain, vulnerable in a way that reminded her painfully of the boy who'd cried in her arms the night his father died, who'd begged her not to leave him alone in the world. He's coming whether we want him to or not, Marcus continued. The question is whether we can find a way to have this conversation without traumatizing him in the process. Soliva looked at her son, this stranger who carried her husband's eyes and her own stubborn chin, but had somehow become someone she barely recognized, and made a decision that surprised them both. Then we better figure out how to be adults before he gets here. Thomas arrived on the early morning train from Zurich, looking both older and younger than his 17 years. Older in the determined set of his jaw, and the way he carried himself with newfound independence. Younger in the obvious anxiety that flickered across his features as he stepped onto the platform. Soliva watched from the cafe window as he emerged into the crisp alpine morning, his single backpack and the careful way he studied the village suggesting he was seeing it through fresh eyes, trying to understand what had drawn his grandmother across an ocean. Marcus had spent the night at the village's only hotel, a small establishment that catered to hikers and tourists seeking authentic alpine experiences. He appeared at the cafe just after Thomas's arrival, his expensive suit replaced by jeans and a sweater that made him look less like a corporate executive and more like the man Soliva sometimes glimpsed beneath his professional armor. Grandmother. Thomas's voice carried relief and something deeper, a need for connection that made Soliva's heart ache. When he hugged her, she was struck by how tall he'd grown, how his embrace felt both familiar and foreign. You look good, he said, studying her face with the artist's eye that had always been his gift. Different, stronger, maybe? I feel stronger, she admitted, then turned to Marcus. Your father and I had a conversation yesterday. We've agreed to try to work through some things. Thomas looked between his father and grandmother with the wariness of someone who'd witnessed too many failed family negotiations. What kind of working through? The honest kind, Father Benedict said, appearing in the cafe doorway with the perfect timing that Soliva had learned to expect from him. If you're all willing. The next 3 hours, spent in Father Benedict's small study above the church, felt like emotional surgery performed without anesthesia. Benedict had a gift for creating space where truth could be spoken without the usual defensive barriers. But that didn't make the process any less painful. Marcus, Benedict said gently, you mentioned yesterday that you've been angry with your mother for 37 years. Can you help us understand what that anger is really about? Marcus sat rigidly in his chair, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. For several minutes the only sound was the distant chiming of the church bells marking the half-hour. She made everything about sacrifice, he finally said, his voice tight with old resentment. After Dad died, it was like she turned martyrdom into an art form. Everything she did, every choice she made, was about what she was giving up for me, the career she'd abandoned, the trips she'd never take, the life she'd put on hold. And I was supposed to, what, be grateful, feel guilty, make it worth it somehow? Soliva felt the words hit like physical blows, but Benedict's gentle pressure on her arm kept her from responding immediately. How did that feel? Benedict asked. Like I could never be enough. Like everything I achieved was still somehow insufficient payment for all her sacrifice. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. And then Dad died, and she was so broken, so completely destroyed. And I was 15, trying to figure out how to grieve my own father while also taking care of a mother who couldn't stop crying. Thomas had gone very still, his artistic sensitivity clearly picking up on currents of pain that had been flowing beneath the surface of their family for decades. I never meant to make you feel responsible for my grief, Soliva said quietly. I was lost. Your father was my anchor, and when he died, I didn't know how to exist without him. But you did exist. You went on. You raised me, managed the finances, kept everything running. Marcus's tone was complex, mixing acknowledgement with frustration. And every single day, you reminded me, not with words but with your whole being, how much it was costing you. Because it was costing me, Soliva replied, her honesty surprising even herself. I was 25 when you were born. I gave up teaching, gave up my independence, gave up pieces of myself until I wasn't sure who I was anymore, outside of being your mother and David's wife. And you resented it. Sometimes, yes. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. Not you specifically, but the way my life had become so small, so defined by everyone else's needs. Thomas spoke for the first time since they'd begun, his voice carefully controlled. Is that why you stayed in that house after I grew up, grandmother? Because you'd forgotten how to want anything for yourself? The question was so perceptive, so precisely aimed at the heart of the matter, that Soliva felt tears threaten. Yes, I think it was. And Dad, Thomas continued, turning to Marcus with the fearless directness of youth, you took that house away from her because you were angry that she'd sacrificed for you, but also angry that her sacrifices made you feel guilty? Marcus looked startled by his son's clear-eyed assessment. It's more complicated than that. Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you both got trapped in this cycle where grandmother gave up everything and felt resentful, and you succeeded at everything but felt guilty, and nobody ever talked about it directly until it exploded. Father Benedict smiled slightly. Thomas has a point. Sometimes the next generation sees patterns that the previous ones are too close to recognize. I need to take responsibility for my part in this, Soliva said, looking directly at Marcus. I did use my sacrifices as a way to control the relationship, not consciously, but if you felt guilty about my choices, that meant you'd never abandon me the way I feared you would. It was manipulative, even if I didn't mean it to be. Marcus stared at her, clearly not having expected such direct acknowledgement. Yes, that's exactly how it felt. And I need to understand something, Soliva continued. When you took the house, was it really about practical concerns? Or was it about punishing me for all those years of emotional manipulation? The silence stretched long enough that Soliva wondered if Marcus would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Both. It was both. He ran his hands through his hair, suddenly looking exhausted. I told myself it was practical. You were getting older, living alone. The house was too big. But the truth is, I wanted you to feel what I'd felt all those years. Powerless. Like someone else was making all the important decisions about your life. Dad? Thomas's voice carried a note of shocked disappointment. I know how it sounds, Marcus said quickly. I know it was cruel. But I was so tired of feeling like the ungrateful son who could never appreciate his mother's sacrifice enough. I wanted you to understand what it felt like to have someone else decide your future without consulting you. Except that's not what I did to you, Soliva said, her voice gaining strength. I made choices about my own life. You made choices about mine. You're right, you're absolutely right. Marcus's admission seemed to cost him physically. I was so caught up in my own hurt that I lost sight of the difference. Father Benedict leaned forward slightly. Marcus, it sounds like you've been carrying this anger for a very long time. Have you ever considered that it might be about more than just your mother's choices? What do you mean? Grief does complicated things to families. You lost your father when you were at a crucial age, old enough to understand death's permanence, but not old enough to process it in healthy ways. Sometimes anger at the surviving parent is really anger at the one who died. The words hung in the air like an unexploded bomb. Marcus went very still, and Soliva could see the moment when Benedict's observation hit home. He left us, Marcus said slowly, as if testing the words. Dad died and left us to figure out how to be a family without him. And that made you angry. Furious. But you can't be angry at someone for dying, especially not your father. So Marcus looked at Soliva with something approaching horror. I made you carry all of it. All my grief, all my fear, all my rage at being abandoned. And I let you, Soliva said gently, because I was so lost in my own grief that I didn't know how to help you process yours. Thomas had been listening with the intense focus that suggested he was fitting pieces of a puzzle together in his mind. Is that why you got so angry whenever grandmother tried to take care of people? Like when she wanted to help with Mom's family stuff? Or when she offered to babysit me more when you guys were having problems? Marcus flinched. How do you know about that? I wasn't deaf. I heard the arguments. Thomas's tone was matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. You always acted like she was trying to interfere, but maybe you were just afraid she'd leave if you let her get too attached to other people? The psychological insight from his 17-year-old son clearly stunned Marcus. Jesus, Thomas. When did you become so smart? Observant? It happens when your family implodes, and you have to figure out how to navigate it. And Dad, Thomas continued, turning to Marcus with the fearless directness of youth. You took that house away from her because you were angry that she'd sacrificed for you, but also angry that her sacrifices made you feel guilty. Marcus looked startled by his son's clear-eyed assessment. It's more complicated than that. Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you both got trapped in this cycle where grandmother gave up everything and felt resentful, and you succeeded at everything but felt guilty, and nobody ever talked about it directly until it exploded. Father Benedict smiled slightly. Thomas has a point. Sometimes the next generation sees patterns that the previous ones are too close to recognize. I need to take responsibility for my part in this, Soliva said, looking directly at Marcus. I did use my sacrifices as a way to control the relationship. Not consciously, but if you felt guilty about my choices, that meant you'd never abandon me the way I feared you would. It was manipulative, even if I didn't mean it to be. Marcus stared at her, clearly not having expected such direct acknowledgement. Yes, that's exactly how it felt. And I need to understand something, Soliva continued. When you took the house, was it really about practical concerns? Or was it about punishing me for all those years of emotional manipulation? The silence stretched long enough that Soliva wondered if Marcus would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Both. It was both. He ran his hands through his hair, suddenly looking exhausted. I told myself it was practical. You were getting older, living alone. The house was too big. But the truth is, I wanted you to feel what I'd felt all those years. Powerless. Like someone else was making all the important decisions about your life. Dad. Thomas's voice carried a note of shocked disappointment. I know how it sounds, Marcus said quickly. I know it was cruel. But I was so tired of feeling like the ungrateful son who could never appreciate his mother's sacrifice enough. I wanted you to understand what it felt like to have someone else decide your future without consulting you. Except that's not what I did to you, Soliva said, her voice gaining strength. I made choices about my own life. You made choices about mine. You're right, you're absolutely right. Marcus's admission seemed to cost him physically. I was so caught up in my own hurt that I lost sight of the difference. Father Benedict leaned forward slightly. Marcus, it sounds like you've been carrying this anger for a very long time. Have you ever considered that it might be about more than just your mother's choices? What do you mean? Grief does complicated things to families. You lost your father when you were at a crucial age. Old enough to understand death's permanence, but not old enough to process it in healthy ways. Sometimes anger at the surviving parent is really anger at the one who died. The words hung in the air like an unexploded bomb. Marcus went very still, and Soliva could see the moment when Benedict's observation hit home. He left us, Marcus said slowly, as if testing the words. Dad died and left us to figure out how to be a family without him. And that made you angry. Furious. But you can't be angry at someone for dying, especially not your father. So Marcus looked at Soliva with something approaching horror. I made you carry all of it. All my grief, all my fear, all my rage at being abandoned. And I let you, Soliva said gently. Because I was so lost in my own grief that I didn't know how to help you process yours. Thomas had been listening with the intense focus that suggested he was fitting pieces of a puzzle together in his mind. Is that why you got so angry whenever grandmother tried to take care of people? Like when she wanted to help with Mom's family stuff, or when she offered to babysit me more when you guys were having problems? Marcus flinched. How do you know about that? I wasn't deaf, I heard the arguments. Thomas's tone was matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. You always acted like she was trying to interfere, but maybe you were just afraid she'd leave if you let her get too attached to other people? The psychological insight from his 17-year-old son clearly stunned Marcus. Jesus, Thomas. When did you become so smart? Observant? It happens when your family implodes, and you have to figure out how to navigate it. I'm proud of you for that choice, Soliva replied, and was surprised to realize she meant it completely. The man standing before her was no longer the entitled stranger who'd invaded her cafe a week ago, but someone closer to the son she remembered. Flawed, damaged, but ultimately reachable. And I meant what I said about coming back, Thomas added, shouldering his backpack. Florence is only 6 hours by train. I want to spend Christmas here, if you'll have me. This will always be home for you, Soliva said, embracing her grandson with the fierce love that had sustained her through all the dark months. Both of you. Marcus's goodbye was more tentative, but genuine. I'm sorry, Mom, for all of it. For the years of anger, for taking the house, for being so broken that I couldn't see what I was destroying. We're all broken in some way, she replied, touching his cheek the way she used to when he was small and hurt. The important thing is that we're finally learning how to heal. After the train disappeared around the mountain curve, Soliva stood on the platform feeling simultaneously drained and energized. The confrontation she'd been dreading for months was behind her, and against all expectations, it had ended not in further destruction, but in the possibility of reconstruction. Klaus appeared at her elbow with his usual perfect timing. Heavy conversations make hungry people, he announced. Ingrid is making rosti. You should eat. The next few weeks passed in a blur of paperwork, appointments, and the careful choreography of building a legal life in Switzerland. Dr. Sarah Chen proved to be a formidable ally in navigating the bureaucratic maze, her 15 years of experience translating into practical advice that cut through confusion like a surgeon's scalpel. The key, Sarah explained during one of their weekly meetings at her pristine office in the village medical center, is demonstrating integration. It's not enough to just live here. You need to prove you're becoming part of the community fabric. How do I do that? You're already doing it. Working at Ingrid's cafe, attending Father Benedict's services, learning German. The municipal office likes to see engagement with local culture and institutions. Sarah's smile was encouraging. Your application is actually quite strong. Single woman with significant financial resources, no criminal background, evidence of community integration, and a local sponsor willing to vouch for your character. Local sponsor? Klaus submitted the paperwork yesterday. Apparently he's willing to guarantee your good behavior and cultural adaptation. Sarah's eyes twinkled with amusement. Interesting development there. The mention of Klaus brought warmth to Soliva's chest that had nothing to do with the heated office. Over the past month, their friendship had deepened into something more complex. Shared meals that stretched into evening conversations, walks through the village that felt less like errands and more like courtship, moments of comfortable silence that spoke of growing intimacy. It was Klaus who suggested she consider teaching English classes for local children, pointing out that the village school had been seeking someone qualified to supplement their language program. You were teacher before, he said during one of their evening walks along the mountain paths that surrounded Grindelwald. Good teachers? They are always teachers. Just need right classroom. The idea appealed to her more than she'd expected. When she met with the school principal, a practical woman named Frau Schneider who spoke excellent English but understood the value of authentic native pronunciation, Soliva felt pieces of her former self clicking back into place. Twice weekly after regular classes, Frau Schneider explained. Voluntary program for children who want extra practice. Not many requirements except patience and enthusiasm. I have both, Soliva replied, and realized it was true. The woman who'd been too tired and beaten down to imagine a future had somehow transformed into someone eager to invest in other people's growth. The first letter from Marcus arrived 3 weeks after his departure, written in his careful business handwriting on cream-colored stationery that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. Dear Mom, Dr. Patterson says I should write to you about my progress, rather than just thinking about it. Apparently, there's something therapeutic about putting thoughts into words that someone else might read. I've been in therapy for 2 weeks now. It's harder than I expected and more helpful than I wanted to admit. We're working through what she calls inherited grief patterns. Basically, how Dad's death affected not just what I felt, but how I learned to feel. Or not feel. I think I spent 37 years being angry at you for surviving when he didn't. Which is completely irrational. But apparently grief doesn't care much about logic. Thomas is doing well. He talks about you constantly, about Switzerland, about how different you seem. He's excited about Florence but also nervous. I'm trying to be supportive instead of skeptical. Dr. Patterson pointed out that my father never got to see me succeed at anything, and maybe that's why I have trouble believing Thomas's dreams are worth pursuing. I hope you're happy there. I hope Klaus is treating you well. Thomas mentioned him. Frequently. I hope you know that I'm working on becoming someone worthy of your forgiveness. Love, Marcus P.S. I'm selling the house. It never felt right living there after what I did. The money will go into a trust for Thomas's education and whatever else he needs. I should have done that from the beginning. Soliva read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of growth and self-awareness. The Marcus who had written these words was someone she could imagine rebuilding a relationship with. Not the son she'd lost, but someone new who understood the difference between love and control. October brought the village's Harvest Festival, a traditional celebration that transformed Grindelwald into something from a fairy tale. Booths selling artisanal cheeses and handcrafted goods lined the main street, traditional music drifted from the square, and the air carried the scent of mulled wine and roasted chestnuts. Soliva found herself swept into the preparations almost without realizing it. Ingrid conscripted her to help with the café's festival booth. Klaus enlisted her assistance in setting up the display of traditional timepieces, and Frau Schneider asked if her English students could perform a short presentation about American autumn traditions. You know, Ingrid said as they arranged pastries in the café's festival booth. This is the first time Klaus has participated in the festival since Anna died. He usually finds excuses to be somewhere else during community celebrations. Really? Grief makes some people want to be around others, makes some people want to hide. Klaus was always a hider. Ingrid's smile was knowing. Until you. That evening, as the festival reached its peak with traditional dancing in the village square, Klaus appeared at Soliva's side with 2 cups of mulled wine and an expression that suggested he'd made some kind of decision. Walk with me, he said quietly. They found themselves on a small hill, overlooking the celebration. The lights and music of the festival spread below them like something from a dream. The mountains rose on all sides, dark silhouettes against a star-filled sky that seemed impossibly vast and intimate at the same time. Anna loved this festival, Klaus said, his voice careful but steady. Every year she would plan for weeks. What to wear, which foods to try, how long to stay for the dancing. She made everything feel like celebration. Soliva waited, understanding that this was leading somewhere important. After she died, I thought celebration was finished for me. Thought joy was something that belonged to my past. He turned to face her directly. You have taught me that joy can have second chapters. The kiss, when it came, was gentle and tentative, flavored with mulled wine and the sort of careful hope that belongs to people who have learned not to take love for granted. When they broke apart, Soliva was surprised to find tears on her cheeks. I haven't been kissed in 5 years, she whispered. I have not kissed anyone but Anna in 45 years, Klaus replied. We are both out of practice. We'll learn. Yes, we will learn. The festival continued around them, but they remained on their hill, talking quietly about the future they were beginning to imagine together. Klaus's house, empty since Anna's death. Soliva's growing sense of belonging in the village. The possibility of building something new while honoring what had come before. 2 weeks later, Thomas arrived for his promised visit, stepping off the train with the confident bearing of someone who had found his place in the world. Art school in Florence was everything he'd hoped. Challenging, inspiring, surrounded by people who understood that beauty was worth pursuing for its own sake. "You look different too," he told Soliva as they walked through the village. "Happier, more present." "I feel present. For the first time in decades, I feel like I'm actually living my life instead of just managing it." Thomas spent 5 days in Grindelwald, sketching the mountains and the village, charming Ingrid and Father Benedict, and developing an easy rapport with Klaus that suggested he approved of his grandmother's romantic choices. "He's good for you," Thomas said on his last evening, as they sat in Klaus's workshop watching the older man demonstrate the intricate process of assembling a mechanical watch. "Dad would like him too, I think, when he's ready to meet him." "And when might that be?" "Sooner than you'd expect. He's been talking about visiting. Says he wants to understand what you found here." Thomas grinned. "Also, I think Dr. Patterson suggested it. Something about confronting the places where his behavior caused damage. The idea of Marcus returning to Switzerland, not as an adversary seeking to reclaim property, but as a son trying to understand his mother, filled Soliva with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Hope, perhaps, mixed with the sort of cautious optimism that comes from watching damaged things slowly repair themselves. As autumn deepened into the first hints of winter, Soliva's residency application moved through the final stages of approval. The interview with the municipal commission was conducted entirely in German, her months of study paying dividends she hadn't expected. When the approval letter arrived, stamped with official seals and bearing the careful signatures of bureaucrats who had decided she was worthy of belonging, she felt something shift permanently in her sense of self. She was no longer an American tourist playing at European life. She was a Swiss resident with legal standing, community connections, and a future that stretched as far as her courage could carry her. The celebration dinner Klaus prepared in her honor was attended by all the people who had become her chosen family. Ingrid and Father Benedict, Dr. Chen and Frau Schneider, even Herr Fischer, who rarely socialized but made an exception for such an important occasion. "To Soliva," Klaus said, raising his glass of wine with the formal precision that marked important Swiss occasions, "who taught us that courage has no expiration date and that family is something you choose as much as something you're born into." "To new beginnings," Soliva replied, looking around the table at faces that had become dear to her, "and to the people who make them possible." As the evening wound down and the guests departed, Klaus and Soliva found themselves alone in his kitchen, surrounded by the comfortable debris of a successful dinner party. The house felt different now. Not like a shrine to his late wife, but like a place where new memories could be built alongside the old ones. "I have something to ask you," Klaus said, his tone suggesting careful consideration of important matters. "What?" "Would you consider moving in here? Not immediately, but when you are ready. The house has good bones, room for 2 people who have learned to appreciate quiet mornings and long conversations." The invitation was characteristically practical, but Soliva could hear the deeper question underneath. Would she consider building a life with him? Would she trust him with the future she was still learning to claim? "Yes," she said simply. "When I'm ready, yes." Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, dusting the village in white that would soon deepen into the full Alpine winter. But inside Klaus's kitchen, with the warmth of good wine and better company surrounding her, Soliva felt nothing but anticipation for whatever came next. She had crossed an ocean to escape one life and discovered the courage to build another. The woman who had once defined herself entirely through other people's needs had learned to want things for herself: love, adventure, a future that belonged to her alone. It had taken 72 years, but she had finally come home to herself. The cafe was decorated with paper lanterns and alpine flowers when Soliva arrived that morning, exactly 1 year after she'd first stepped off the train in Grindelwald, with nothing but a suitcase and desperate courage. Ingrid had insisted on marking the anniversary, enlisting the entire village in what had become an impromptu celebration of transformation. 1 year, Ingrid said, embracing her with the fierce affection that had sustained Soliva through her darkest moments of doubt. From lost tourist to beloved neighbor. Not bad for someone who claimed she'd made the worst decision of her life. The morning passed in a blur of well-wishers and congratulations. Herr Fischer presented her with a small carved wooden bird, a traditional Swiss symbol of homecoming. Frau Schneider brought photos from the English program, now expanded to include adult classes that drew participants from neighboring villages. Even the municipal clerk who'd once regarded her residency application with skepticism stopped by with official flowers and stiff congratulations. But it was Klaus's suggestion of an afternoon hike that truly marked the significance of the day. They climbed familiar paths that had become sacred geography over the months, routes where she'd learned to breathe alpine air without gasping, where conversations had deepened from polite friendship into something approaching love. 1 year ago, you could barely make it to the first overlook without stopping, Klaus observed as they reached a meadow that offered panoramic views of the surrounding peaks. Now you climb like mountain goat. A very old mountain goat, Soliva replied, but she was proud of the physical strength she'd developed, the way her body had adapted to this landscape that demanded both resilience and respect. Klaus stopped walking, his expression suddenly serious in the way that suggested important conversations ahead. Soliva, this year has been gift for me. You brought life back to places I thought were finished. Klaus, let me finish. He reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box that made her breath catch. I am not young man proposing with grand gestures. I am old man asking if you will share whatever years remain. The ring was simple and perfect, a single diamond set in a band that spoke of elegance rather than ostentation. When Klaus slipped it onto her finger, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle she'd been unconsciously solving for months. Yes, she said, surprising herself with the immediate certainty. Yes, of course. Their engagement celebration that evening coincided with Thomas's arrival for what had become his regular visits between semesters. He stepped off the train looking every inch the serious art student. Paint stains on his clothes, portfolio case slung across his shoulder, and the focused intensity that suggested complete absorption in his craft. Grandmother, he said, embracing her with the easy affection that had remained constant through all their family's upheavals. You look radiant, like someone with excellent news. She showed him the ring, and his whoop of joy could probably be heard in the next canton. Klaus! Thomas called, spotting his grandmother's fiancé approaching from the parking area. Congratulations! You're getting the best woman in Switzerland. I know this, Klaus replied with characteristic directness, but his smile suggested deep satisfaction with the arrangement. Over dinner at Father Benedict's, who had insisted on hosting another family celebration, Thomas shared his own news. The art residency program in Switzerland had accepted his application for the following year, a prestigious placement that would allow him to study traditional alpine landscape techniques while maintaining his enrollment in Florence. So I'll be here for 6 months, he explained, his excitement barely contained. June through November. Long enough to really understand the light, the way the seasons change the colors. And long enough to help plan a wedding, Soliva added, earning applause from the gathered friends who had become her chosen family. 3 weeks later, Marcus arrived for his second visit to Switzerland, this time accompanied by a woman named Jennifer, whose easy laugh and obvious affection for him suggested that therapy was yielding practical as well as emotional dividends. Marcus himself looked different, lighter somehow, as if he'd finally set down burdens he'd been carrying for decades. Mom, he said, embracing her with genuine warmth rather than dutiful obligation. You look happy. Really, genuinely happy. I am. For the first time in years, I wake up looking forward to the day. Marcus's visit lasted a week, during which he hiked with Klaus, charmed Ingrid into teaching him basic German, and spent long evenings in conversation with Father Benedict about forgiveness and family reconstruction. But perhaps most importantly, he apologized. Not the grudging admission of wrongdoing that had marked their previous encounters, but the heartfelt acknowledgement of someone who truly understood the damage he'd caused. "I stole more than your house," he said on their last evening together. "I stole your sense of security, your trust in family, your belief that you mattered. I'm sorry doesn't cover it, but it's where I have to start." "You've already started," Soliva replied, "by becoming someone worthy of forgiveness, by showing Thomas what growth looks like, by choosing healing over resentment." As winter deepened into spring, Soliva found herself contemplating a new project, the story of her transformation, from displaced mother to confident expatriate, seemed worth recording, not from vanity, but from recognition that other women might find inspiration in her unlikely journey. "You should write it," Dr. Chen encouraged during one of their monthly coffee meetings. "The memoir of reinvention. Heaven knows enough women need to hear that it's never too late to choose yourself." The writing came easier than expected, perhaps because the story felt complete in ways that mattered. Each chapter tracked not just external changes, the move to Switzerland, the new relationships, the bureaucratic victories, but internal transformation from someone who defined herself through others' needs to someone who claimed her own desires. More importantly, the memoir led to an unexpected opportunity. A women's foundation in Zurich, impressed by her story, invited her to establish a scholarship fund for women over 50 seeking to reinvent their lives. The Soliva Turner Foundation for New Beginnings would provide both financial support and mentorship for women brave enough to start over when society suggested they should be winding down. "It's perfect," Thomas said when she shared the news during his summer residency. Grandmother Turner, champion of second chances. The foundation's first recipient was a 63-year-old teacher from Vermont, whose husband's death had left her questioning everything she'd assumed about her future. Standing in Soliva's old position, scared, alone, but determined to claim something better, she represented the continuation of a story that extended far beyond one woman's journey to Switzerland. On a crisp autumn morning exactly 18 months after her arrival, Soliva stood on the balcony of the house she now shared with Klaus, watching the mountains catch the early light. Thomas was in his studio, preparing canvases for his latest series. Klaus was in his workshop, restoring a pocket watch that had belonged to someone's grandfather. The village below was beginning its daily rhythm of purposeful activity. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Jennifer said yes. We're engaged. Planning a small ceremony next spring. Hope you and Klaus can make it back to the States for a few days." The idea of returning to America, not as a refugee seeking escape, but as a confident woman visiting her former country, filled her with anticipation rather than dread. She was no longer running from her old life. She had built something better. "Good news?" Klaus asked, appearing with coffee in the morning newspaper. "The best news. Marcus is engaged. And happy, from the sound of it." "Good. Happy sons make for peaceful mothers." As they settled into their morning routine, coffee, newspaper, quiet conversation about the day's plans, Soliva reflected on the distance she'd traveled, not just geographically, but emotionally. The woman who had once believed her story was ending had discovered it was actually beginning. She was 73 years old, engaged to a man who cherished her intelligence as much as her company, surrounded by a community that valued her contributions, and committed to helping other women discover their own capacity for reinvention. The mountains stood eternal and welcoming, witnesses to her transformation from victim to victor, from someone who endured life to someone who actively chose it. She had finally learned the most important lesson of all. It's never too late to come home to yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,